CBS News has learned that after weeks of deliberations, congressional Democrats and the White House will unveil a sweeping immigration bill. The two-tiered legalization plan would allow millions of immigrants living in the country without authorization to obtain legal status. California Congresswoman Linda Sanchez and New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez are set to introduce the proposal in the House and the Senate, respectively. Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe for the latest on what's happening at the White House. So, Ed, walk us through how this program would work and remind us how the last effort to pass comprehensive immigration reform went, particularly under the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, good morning, guys. From a slushy White House, that same weather system that's been affecting things in the South is upending the White House schedule, where the president, they've already declared a lid on the day. He's not going anywhere. He was supposed to go to Michigan for a visit to the Pfizer vaccine distribution center there in Kalamazoo, and will make that trip instead tomorrow because the weather across the D.C. area is just too bad. Immigration then becomes central to the day here. Two-tier legalization program, as you mentioned. The first would cover millions of farm workers, people under the temporary protected status program, people from countries like El Salvador, Haiti, and Syria, and then dreamers, those children who were brought here as undocumented immigrants. They'd all be eligible for green cards or lawful permanent residence after 3 years. They'd be able to apply for citizenship. All other eligible undocumented immigrants, and that number runs anywhere from 8 to 11 to 12 million who were here before January 1st, would be able to get onto an 8-year pathway to citizenship if they're considered eligible. They haven't committed crimes, they pay back taxes and fees, they pass a background check. These are sort of standard legalization pathways, as they might say in legislative parlance, that have been out there for several years, that have been tried and have failed to get enacted by Congress really since the Bush administration. Because Republicans turn around and say, look, you want to legalize or get people on a path to legalization, you got to also enforce immigration laws and enforce border security. Nothing about that in this bill that's being introduced today by Democrats. So the White House turns around and says, look, if Republicans have thoughts on immigration enforcement, on border security, bring them. The president's willing to consider them, potentially add them to this legislation with Democrats to try to get something done. But what's interesting about this, guys, it's being introduced by two essentially rank-and-file Democrats. Bob Menendez, the New Jersey senator, has been involved in these immigration talks before, but not somebody who's in congressional leadership, not somebody who's known to have a large power base across the aisle, who can bring Republicans to the table necessarily. And so it's a signal that while it's a priority here at the White House, it's not necessarily a big one on Capitol Hill just yet, which obviously is still working through the legislation to provide relief from the pandemic, and then is going to have to consider a host of other issues in the Senate, like finishing up nominations of cabinet officials and potentially federal judges. So we'll see when and if this issue really gets a time and attention up on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, you mentioned, relief from the pandemic, and I suppose, the administration has to show that it's working on other things, but we all know that we can't really move on until we get a handle on this pandemic and right the sort of financial ship as well. So yesterday, the White House COVID-19 response team, they announced a $1.6 billion multi-pronged effort to expand COVID-19 testing and genomic sequencing, which is something that's happening, in Europe, but we here in the U.S. has been a little late to this game. The White House's COVID-19 testing coordinator described this effort as a pilot until Congress passes that $1.9 trillion relief bill. What more can you tell us about just how this money is going to be used?
Yeah, essentially the Departments of Defense and Health and Human Services are going to be spending that money on expanding testing sites across the country and essentially pushing them into schools and other public facilities across the country. Homeless shelters is another one, for example. They're also spending a big chunk of money, about $815 million, to increase domestic manufacturing of testing supplies. This is actually the interesting element of this. If you've had a COVID test, then you know that you need things like the filter pipette tips or the other aspect, the paper, the very thin paper that gets used to sort of wrap around some of these tests, the plastic on those machines that do the rapid testing of samples. Those things cost money. They take time to produce. This is designed to boost domestic manufacturing of that. And then the genomic sequencing, again, as you said, something that has been done a lot in Europe and other parts of the world, not as much here. About $200 million to expand that here in the United States. Billions more would come if the American Rescue Plan is passed as written, and that is still anticipated at some point in March.
So, Ed, as you know, President Biden and Vice President Harris both doubled down on the message to prioritize vaccinating teachers. But, as you also know, yesterday, Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters neither the president or the vice president believe it's a requirement, which sort of echoes the CDC's guidance on the matter. This all came after Dr. Anthony Fauci said it would be non-workable for all teachers to get immunized before reopening schools. So, why are we hearing these contradictory messages from within the administration?
It's a great question, Vlad. This is a pretzel unlike any other that they've wrapped themselves into, because while everyone was waiting for that CDC recommendation, what do we do about schools? What do we do about testing of them? They said not necessary. Medical experts like Dr. Fauci said not necessary. But both the president and vice president went out there and said, well, okay, we got this testing from them. We would like to see them prioritized. But first of all, federal government can't tell states and cities who to prioritize. They can merely recommend it. And second, the science shows, as those CDC recommendations now call out, that they don't necessarily need to be tested in order to begin safely teaching again in school. So they're getting accused by their critics of touting and promoting and pushing for the testing of teachers at the behest of teacher unions across the country that are some of the most supportive blocs of voters in local, state, and federal elections for Democrats. And, you saw the cleanup from Jen Psaki to sort of say, look, obviously that's our preference, but we agree it's not necessary. But that was only after several days of twisting and rhetorical knots that I think in this case the attack or the criticism that they're doing this at the behest of those that, work for and support teachers is somewhat true. And that's not to say that teachers don't deserve to be vaccinated, obviously. They're a frontline worker alongside nurses and doctors and police officers and firefighters. But in this case, it was seen, at least politically, as something that was being done for a key constituency.
All right, so talk about key constituents. The president seems to be at odds with some key Democratic leaders over calls to cancel up to $50,000 worth of financial student debt. He basically out and out said, that's not going to happen. $50,000, too much. So I got to ask you, that puts him directly at odds with some of the more outspoken Democratic members of Congress. Why is he doing that?
Well, and it's not necessarily that it's too much. It's that he doesn't think he has the legal authority to do it through executive action. So he did it for about $10,000 worth of federal-backed student loan relief. And that was done very quickly at the beginning of the presidency. But to get to $50,000, he says, I just don't think I can do it from a legal standpoint. And the White House won't say this, but I think it's fair to turn it around on the liberal Democrats that are pushing for this and say, why aren't you passing legislation that would do it? Why aren't you pushing for something that would do it? So Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, several dozen progressive Democrats in the House are the ones pushing for this. Various groups yesterday said, look, if the president is saying he's not going to do it, pick up the phone, call the White House, put pressure on them to try to get him to change his mind. But it doesn't sound like he's going to do it. And this is a great example, again, of the conflict that exists between a president who's far more centrist and somewhat practical about how Washington works, and the left of his party that has been pushing for bolder, more aggressive action on a host of issues. And he's just sort of throwing up his hands and saying, guys, we can't go there, or at least I can't do it alone. And he's not saying it, but again, I think the question is worth asking, why not just introduce legislation and try to get it passed when you have total control of the House and the Senate?
Let me ask you about something else, Ed. President Biden says he is giving his support to studying reparations for Black Americans in Congress as the president tries to win congressional support for other items on his agenda. How aggressively is he likely to back this bill?
That's essentially all they've said, is that it's not a bill necessarily. It's just it would be a bill if they establish some kind of a commission. But essentially, the White House is saying he supports studying it further. That's about as minimal a statement and a level of support as he can give. I think to Anne Marie's point earlier, when you've got all these other bigger, more urgent priorities that have to be addressed, you can't necessarily throw political capital around something that clearly is important, that many in Washington believe merits further study and discussion. and is something that he understands should be, and that there are people in this country that want it to be. Whether he outright supports reparations, they didn't go there, but he's certainly open to the discussion. And that's a position that most presidential candidates took over the last 2 years, and one that he certainly is willing to, to see where the issue goes. But again, look at what we've already discussed this morning. Economic recovery from the pandemic, solving a chronic domestic policy issue, immigration, and whether or not to help relieve people from thousands of dollars of student loans. You throw this other issue into the mix as well, and it just shows you the kind of decisions that have to be made by this White House every day.
There is a lot to tackle, a lot to get their handle on. Ed O'Keefe, you're there reporting it on it all. Thank you very much, my friend. Appreciate it.
You guys put me through my paces every morning. I'm here for you.
And you're doing it in the snow, too. I mean, welcome to life in the field,
Exactly.
in the snow. Something you're very familiar with, having you covered, crisscrossed the entire country, and now you're finally a little bit stationary, which is nice.
There's a roof over our heads, at least.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's cool. Thank you, my friend.